The Dream of a Ridiculous Man. Chapter 1. I'm a ridiculous man. Now they call me a madman. That would be a promotion if I weren't just as ridiculous as before in their eyes. But it no longer makes me angry. I find them all nice now, even when they laugh at me. Indeed, if they do, they're somehow particularly dear to me. I'd even laugh with them, not really at myself, but out of sheer love for them, if looking at them didn't make me so sad. Sad because they don't know the truth, while I do. It's so hard to be the only one to know the truth. But they won't understand it. No, they won't. And yet, looking ridiculous used to upset me very much. In fact, I didn't just look ridiculous, I was ridiculous. I've always been ridiculous, and I think I've known it from the day of my birth. Perhaps I became fully aware of it at the age of 7. I studied at school, then at university, and the more I studied, the more I realized that I was ridiculous. For me, in the final analysis, higher learning amounted to explaining and proving my ridiculousness. And in life, it was the same as in my studies. Every year I became more conscious that I looked ridiculous in every respect. Everyone has always laughed at me, but no one has ever suspected that the one person in the world who knew just how ridiculous I was none other than myself. And that was what hurt me more than anything. But then I only had myself to blame. I was proud and never wanted to admit it to anyone, and my pride kept growing with the years. If I had admitted to anyone that I knew I was ridiculous, I believe I'd have shattered my skull with a bullet that very night. Yes, I worried terribly during my adolescence that I would break down one day and admit it to my schoolmates. But once I reached adulthood, although I found out more and more about this horrible peculiarity of mine, I somehow became more resigned to it. I say somehow because to this day I cannot account for it. Maybe it was the result of the conviction that dawned upon me quite independently of my will that nothing made any difference in this world. I had suspected this for a very long time, but I only became fully aware of it during this past year. I suddenly felt it really made no difference to me whether or not the world existed. I began to feel with my whole being that nothing had happened while I'd been alive. At first I felt that, to make up for it, many things had happened before. Later, however, I realized this was an illusion. Nothing had happened before either. Little by little, I discovered that nothing will ever happen. Then I stopped getting angry at people and almost stopped noticing them. This change manifested itself even in the smallest things. When I walked along the street, for instance, I would bump into people. I was certainly not absorbed in thought, for what did I have to think about by that time? I just didn't care about anything anymore. If only I could have answered some of the many questions that tormented me, but I hadn't found a single answer. Then I became indifferent to everything, and all the questions faded away. It was only later that I learned the truth. I discovered it last November 3rd to be precise. Since then, I remember every moment. It was a gloomy evening, as gloomy as they come. I was returning home at night between 10 and 11, and I remember remarking that it was impossible to imagine a gloomier moment, even in its physical aspect. Rain was pouring down, and it was the coldest, gloomiest rain possible. In fact, it was awesome. I remember that clearly. It was awesome and obviously hostile to man. And then, before 11, the rain stopped and was replaced by a monstrous dampness, damper and colder than the rain had been. A strange steam billowed from every object, from every stone, every side street, as one looked down it from the corner. I suddenly felt that if all the gas lights went out at once, everywhere, the picture would be more cheerful, because it was by gaslight that all these things could be seen. I hadn't dined that day. I had sat since early evening in the house of an engineer. 2 of his friends were there too. I had been mostly silent, and I believe they were rather bored with me. They were discussing something that excited them, and at one point their discussion became heated. Yet they didn't really care. They got excited for the pleasure of it, and I said so. "Good God," I said. "Don't you realize that you yourselves don't really care one way or the other?" They weren't offended. They just laughed at me. They laughed because I hadn't spoken reproachfully, but simply because everything was all the same to me. They saw that it was all the same to me, and it made them laugh. When I had that idea about the gaslights in the street, I glanced at the sky. It was very dark, but I could make out torn clouds and bottomless black gaps between them. Suddenly I noticed a little star in one of those gaps. I looked at it intently. That star reminded me that I wanted to kill myself. I decided I would go through with it that very night. The idea of killing myself had implanted itself firmly in my mind 2 months before, and poor though I was, I'd bought myself an excellent revolver and loaded it that first day. But 2 months had passed, and the revolver was still lying in my desk drawer. Killing myself was a matter of such indifference to me that I felt like waiting for a moment when it would make some difference. I can't tell you why I felt that way. Anyway, I kept waiting for the right moment. Now that star gave me the idea of going through with it that very night, without fail. Why that star gave me that idea, I cannot say. But just as I was looking at the star, along came a little girl and grasped me by the elbow. The street was quite deserted. At a distance, a cabman was asleep on his box. The little girl was about 8. She had a scarf tied around her head and wore a ragged overcoat. She was all wet from the damp. But what struck me especially were her battered, wet shoes. I remember them to this day. She started tugging at my elbow, trying to make me pay attention to her. She wasn't crying. She was spasmodically shouting some indistinct words which she couldn't pronounce too clearly, as she was shivering with cold. Something must have frightened her, for she kept repeating, "Mummy, Mummy!" And there was terror in her voice. I just glanced at her and, without saying a word, started walking away. She ran after me, tugging at my sleeve. I discerned a note in her voice that indicates despair in badly frightened children. I know that note well, and although she spoke indistinctly, I gathered that her mother was dying somewhere, or that something had happened to her and she'd rushed out to get help. But I wouldn't follow her. In fact, I decided to chase her away. I started by telling her to go and find a policeman, but she clasped her little hands together and trotted along at my side, sobbing, trying to catch her breath. Finally, I stamped my foot and shouted at her. She whimpered, "Mister, mister," turned away, and darted across the street. Someone else had appeared there, and she apparently had left me for him. I reached the 5th floor where I live. I have just one room. It's small and poor. It has only a semicircular skylight for a window. There's an oilcloth-covered sofa, a desk loaded with books, 2 straight chairs, and an old but very comfortable armchair. I lit a candle, sat down, and began to think. Behind the wall in the room next door there was Bedlam. A retired army captain lived there. He had, as usual, some 6 visitors drinking vodka and playing cards with an old, greasy pack. The night before, there had been a fight, and 2 of them had pulled each other's hair for a long time. The landlady had wanted to complain to the police, but she was too afraid of the captain. There's only one other tenant on this floor, a thin, smallish lady, married to some army man. She came from out of town with her 3 children, who took ill here in the house immediately upon arrival. She and her children are also terribly afraid of the captain. Every night they shake with fear and cross themselves. The youngest child once even had a fit out of sheer terror. I know for certain that from time to time the captain stops people in Nevsky Avenue and begs them for a handout. He cannot get a job. Strangely enough, and that's why I'm telling all this, I haven't once felt any resentment for the captain during the month that he's lived here. Of course, I have avoided his company. He got bored with me practically as soon as we met. But I don't mind all the racket behind the wall in the least. Let them do what they want. It's all the same to me. I can sit up all night without hearing them, completely forgetting that they exist. I haven't gone to sleep before dawn for a year now. I just sit throughout the night in my armchair doing nothing. I read books only during the day. At night, I just sit without even thinking, just allowing shreds of thoughts to wander in their leisure. I use up a whole candle every night. I sat quietly at the desk, took the revolver out of the drawer, and placed it in front of me. As I put it down, I remember asking myself, is this really it? And answering categorically, it is. I'd shoot myself. I knew I'd shoot myself that night. I didn't know, however, how long I'd sit at my desk first, and there's no doubt that I would have shot myself had it not been for that little girl. Chapter 2. You see, although I didn't care one way or the other, I still felt pain. I'd have felt physical pain if someone had hit me, and the same applies to mental pain. If I'd witnessed something sad, I'd have felt pity just as much as I would have before I ceased to care about anything in this life. I felt pity that night, most certainly enough to help a child. Then why hadn't I helped that little girl? Well, I hadn't helped her because of a thought that occurred to me at that moment. It was a question I couldn't answer, an idle question, but it made me lose my temper. I grew angry because I'd come to the conclusion that if I decided to end my life that night, then everything in this world should be, more than ever, a matter of complete indifference to me. Why, then, had I suddenly realized that it wasn't, and felt sorry for that little girl? I remember how sorry I felt for her, so sorry that it hurt, and this was incredible in my state. I really don't know how to convey how I felt then, but the feeling persisted after I got home and sat down at my table. I was irritated, as I hadn't been for a long time. I reasoned. It seems obvious that if I am still a man and not a zero, then as long as I haven't turned into a zero, I am living. Hence I can suffer, get angry, and feel ashamed of my actions. That's so. But if I'm to kill myself in, say, 2 hours, what concern of mine can that little girl possibly be? And how can I care about notions like shame or, for that matter, anything else in the world? I'm about to be turned into an absolute zero. So how is it possible that the knowledge that I'm about to stop existing completely, and therefore that everything else will stop existing, did not diminish in the least my pity for that little girl, or my shame over committing a despicable action? When I stamped my foot and shouted at that poor girl, it was as if I wanted to say, "Here, see, I don't feel any pity, and what's more, Even if I commit an unspeakable crime now, it will be all right because inside of 2 hours everything will be extinguished. Can you believe that that was why I shouted? I am almost certain of it. It seemed obvious to me that my whole life, and with it the whole world, were at the mercy of my whim. I could even put it this way. It looked as if the world had been made especially for me alone. If I shot myself, the world would stop existing, at least for me, to say nothing of the possibility that indeed there wouldn't be anything or anyone left after me. And as my consciousness sputtered out, the whole world would vanish like a phantom, like a mere figment of that consciousness of mine. For it is possible that all the world and all the people are nothing but me. I remember that, as I sat and reasoned like this, I kept rephrasing and twisting all the questions one after another that occurred to me, and in the end, quite new and unexpected considerations started cropping up. At one point I wondered how it would be if, after living on the moon or Mars and committing some horribly shameful deed there that dishonored and disgraced me in a way that can be imagined only in a nightmare, if after that I were transported to Earth and remained conscious of what I'd done on the other planet to which I'd never return, would it then be all the same to me as I gazed at the moon from the Earth, or wouldn't it? Would I feel ashamed of the base act I'd committed there, or not? These questions were idle and useless, since the gun lay on the table in front of me, and every bone in me knew that I was going to use it. Still, they tormented me, and that drove me mad. It was as if I could no longer die without deciding something beforehand. In short, that girl saved me, because the questions she stirred up delayed the shot. Behind the wall in the captain's room, things were growing quieter. They had finished playing cards, and were trying to settle down and drop off to sleep lazily, winding up their arguments and swearing drowsily at one another. It was then that I suddenly fell asleep, something that had never happened to me before while sitting in my armchair at my desk. Sleep crept up on me and caught me completely unawares. A dream is a strange thing. Pictures appear with terrifying clarity, the minutest details engraved like pieces of jewelry, and yet we leap unawares through huge abysses of time and space. Dreams seem to be controlled by wish rather than reason, the heart rather than the head, and yet what clever, tricky convolutions my reason sometimes makes while I'm asleep. Things quite beyond comprehension happen to reason in dreams. My brother, for instance, died 5 years ago. Sometimes I dream of him. He shares in all my worries and takes a great interest in everything, despite the fact that throughout my dream I'm fully aware that he is dead and buried. Why, then, doesn't it bother me that although dead, he's still worrying and busy by my side? How can reason allow it? But enough of that. Now I'll speak of my dream. Yes, I had that dream on November 3rd. They tease me now, reminding me that it was nothing but a dream. But what difference does it make, since the dream revealed the truth to me? Once you've found truth, you know it's the truth, and that there isn't and can't be any other truth, whether you're asleep or awake. So, let it be a dream. Yet that waking life that you praise so much, well, I was about to extinguish it by killing myself when my dream, that dream of mine, revealed a new, great, regenerated, powerful life to me. Listen, then. Chapter 3. I said I had slipped into sleep without noticing it, still juggling with the eternal questions. Suddenly I saw myself reach out for the revolver and, without getting up from my armchair, pointed at my heart, yes, at my heart, and not at my head, despite the fact that I had resolved to shoot myself in the head. or to be more precise, in the right temple. So I pointed the revolver at my breast and waited like that for perhaps a couple of seconds. The candle, the table, and the wall started to sway before my eyes. I hurriedly pressed the trigger. In a dream, you may fall from a great height. You may be splashed or punched without ever feeling pain, unless you actually hurt yourself in your bed, in which case you'll experience pain and almost always wake up. So it was in my dream. I felt no pain, but I fancied that my shot shook everything around me. Then all light sputtered out, and it turned horribly black. It was as if I'd turned blind and mute. I was supine on something hard. I couldn't see or budge. Around me, people were moving to and fro and shouting. I could make out the captain's deep voice and the screams of the landlady. Then there was a gap, and I was carried off in a closed coffin. I felt the coffin sway. Then I was suddenly struck by the thought that, after all, I was dead now. Dead for good. There was no doubt about it in my mind. I could neither move nor see, but still I felt and I thought. Soon, as is usual in dreams, I began to accept things without question. Then they buried me. They left, and I was all alone. I didn't stir. Previously, when I had imagined how they'd bury me in my grave, I always associated sensations of cold and damp with it. Now, indeed, I had an acute sensation of cold, especially in the tips of my toes, but that was all I felt. I lay there, strangely enough, waiting for nothing, accepting as a matter of fact that a dead man has nothing for which to wait. But I was damp. I don't know how much time went by, an hour, a few days, or many days, but suddenly a drop of moisture that had seeped through the lid of my coffin fell on my left eye. Then, a minute later, a second drop fell. Then, after another minute, a third, and so on, always at 1-minute intervals. Unexpectedly, this made me terribly indignant, and I felt an acute pain in my heart. It must be my wound, I decided. The bullet must still be in there. And moisture still dripped every minute on my closed left eye. Suddenly, I called out to the Creator who ordained all that was happening to me, not with my voice, for I couldn't move my tongue, but with my whole being. Whoever you are, if you exist, if there is anything more sensible than what's happening here, make it happen. But if you are avenging yourself for my unreasonable suicide by inflicting upon me the inane disgrace of existence beyond life, be sure that no suffering inflicted upon me can equal the silent contempt that will be in me throughout millions of years of martyrdom. I made this appeal and fell silent. The dead silence lasted for almost a full minute. Another drop fell. But I knew I had unshakable faith that things were about to change. Then my grave opened. I couldn't tell whether it was dug open or what, but some dark, mysterious creature seized me, and then we were in space. Suddenly I could see. It was dark all around, darker than I'd ever seen before. We were moving through space at a fantastic speed, and were already quite far from the Earth. I asked no questions of the creature that was carrying me off. I was too proud. I waited. I assured myself that I wasn't afraid, and the thought that I wasn't afraid made my heart vibrate with tremendous self-satisfaction. I don't remember how long we went on flying like that. I haven't the faintest idea. It was the way it always is in dreams. We leap over space, time, the laws of reason and existence, and stop only at points dear to our hearts. I remember suddenly seeing a little star in the darkness. "Is it serious?" I asked, forgetting I wasn't going to ask questions. "No. It is the star you saw in the gap between the clouds on your way home," the creature carrying me said. The creature bore a human resemblance. I didn't like it. I even felt a deep aversion for it. Having fired at my heart, I had expected to cease to be completely. Instead, I had put myself in the hands of a creature that, although of course not human, still did exist. So there is life beyond the grave, I decided with the puzzling light-heartedness of a dream. But it didn't change anything in me deep down. If I must be again and live according to someone's omnipotent will, I thought, I don't want to be vanquished and humiliated. You know very well that I'm afraid of you, and that's why you despise me, I said suddenly to the companion, unable to prevent myself from making this admission and feeling a scorching humiliation. He didn't answer, but it suddenly dawned on me that I was not being despised or laughed at or even pitied, that our journey had an unknown, mysterious purpose concerning me alone. Fear mounted in me. My silent companion mutely communicated something that permeated the whole of me. We soared through the dark, unknown spaces. I had long since ceased to see any constellations familiar to the eye. I knew that there were stars in the celestial spaces whose rays took millions of years to travel to the earth, but we had probably passed beyond them by now. I was waiting for something in terrible anguish. I was completely exhausted. Suddenly, a familiar and unbelievable nostalgic feeling shook me. I saw our sun. I knew it couldn't be our sun, the sun that gave birth to our earth. I knew we were infinitely far from our sun. But somehow everything inside me knew that this sun was exactly the same as the other. Its copy, its double. A delightful nostalgia filled me with rapture. Light, kindred to that which had given me birth, warmed my heart and brought it back to life, and for the first time since the grave, I felt alive. "But if the sun is exactly similar to our sun," I cried, "where is the earth?" My companion pointed to the little star twinkling with an emerald light in the darkness. We were flying straight towards it. "Are such duplications possible in the universe?" I asked. "Is this the law of nature? And if that star is the earth, can it really be like our earth, wretched, yet eternally dear to the hearts of her most ungrateful children?" Overwhelming love for the earth I had left made me tremble. A vision of the little girl I had wronged flashed before me. "You'll see," my traveling companion said, and I detected a note of sadness in its voice. In the meantime, we were rapidly approaching the planet. It grew before my eyes. I could already make out the oceans, the outline of Europe, when suddenly a strange, powerful, holy indignation exploded within me. How can there be such a duplication, and what is its purpose? I love and can only love the earth I left behind, the earth I stained with my blood when, ungrateful man that I was, I shot myself through the heart to snuff out my life. I never ceased to love the earth, not even on the night that I left it. In fact, my love for it then was probably more poignant than ever. Is there any suffering on this new earth? On our old earth, we can truly love only with suffering and through suffering. We don't know how to love otherwise. We don't know any other love. I want to suffer so that I may love. I'm longing this very minute to kiss the earth I left behind with tears streaming down my cheeks. I don't want any other earth. I won't consent to live on any other planet. But my companion had already left me. I suddenly found myself standing on that other earth, wallowing in the bright, gorgeous sunlight of a day in paradise. I believe I was on an island of the Greek archipelago, or perhaps somewhere on the coast of the Greek mainland. Everything was exactly as it is on our earth, but there was a holiday air about, an aura of supreme triumph. A tender emerald sea splashed quietly, kissing the shore with love that seemed almost conscious. Magnificent tall trees stood in the full glory of their blooming, and I felt that their luxuriant innumerable leaves were welcoming me with their gentle rustle, whispering words of love. Bright, fragrant flowers blazed in the lush grass. Flocks of birds flew through the air. They were not afraid of me, and alighted on my shoulders and hands. I felt the joyful beat of their fluttering little wings against my body. Finally, I met the people of this happy earth. They came toward me, pressed around me, and embraced me. And oh, how beautiful were these children of the sun. Their own sun, that is. I'd never come across such beauty in human beings on our earth. Only perhaps in children, in their first years, would it have been possible to find a remote suggestion of that beauty. The eyes of these happy people were radiant, and their faces were intelligent, expressing the serenity of those who have supremely fulfilled themselves. But there was also simple childlike joy in their faces and voices. Yes, after one glance in their faces, I understood everything. This earth hadn't been desecrated by the fall of man. Its inhabitants still lived in a paradise such as that of Adam and Eve before they sinned. Only here, paradise extended over the entire earth. These people laughed happily, thronged around me, and lavished kindness upon me. They took me to their homes. Each of them was anxious to make me happy. They didn't ask me any questions, appearing to know everything already. They were in a hurry to remove the signs of suffering from my features. Chapter 4. All right, I suppose it was nothing but a dream. Still, the sensation of love left in me by those pure and beautiful people has stayed with me always. I still, to this day, feel their love flying out of me. I saw them myself, I understood them, and I'm certain that they loved me, that I suffered for them afterward. Of course, I realized even then that many things in them were beyond my grasp. For instance, being a modern Russian believer in progress and a vulgar denizen of Petersburg, I couldn't see how they could know so much when there was no indication that they had any knowledge of the achievements of our modern science. But I soon realized that their knowledge fed upon different revelations than ours, and that their aspirations were quite different. They didn't want anything, and were absolutely serene. They didn't strive to find the meaning of life because their own lives were full of meaning. Their understanding was of a higher order and deeper than that provided by science. Science tries to explain what life is in order to teach us how we should live. They didn't need science to tell them how to live. They knew by themselves. I understood that, although I couldn't account for their knowledge. They pointed at their trees, and I couldn't comprehend the intensity of the love with which they looked at them. It was as if they were communicating with beings like themselves. In fact, I don't think I'd be wrong in saying that they talked to them. Yes, they'd found the language of the plants, and I'm sure they could understand them. And these people were like that with all nature. The animals lived in peace with them, never attacked them, loved them. They were subdued, as it were, by love. The people pointed out stars to me and spoke to me about them. I couldn't understand what they said, but I'm certain they had some sort of communion with the stars, a live, direct knowledge of them rather than a rational scientific understanding. Those people never even tried to make me understand them. They loved me anyway. And I knew that they'd never understand me. That's why I hardly ever mentioned our earth to them. I simply kissed their soil in front of them and mutely adored them. They let me adore them without any embarrassment, for they themselves had so much love for me. They didn't suffer for me when, with tears in my eyes, I kissed their feet, for they knew the strength of the love in their hearts with which they returned my love. I used to stop and wonder now and then why they never once caused me to feel offended and never aroused envy or jealousy in a man like me. Why did a braggart and a liar like me never once feel like parading my knowledge of science and philosophy, about which they obviously had no idea? I was never impelled to surprise them and teach them what I knew, not even out of love for them. They were as playful and gay as children. They strolled through their beautiful woods and meadows singing their sweet songs, gathering honey and the fragrant fruit of their forests, and sipping the milk of the friendly, loving animals. Obtaining food and clothing required little effort. They knew love and begot children, but I never detected among them those outbursts of cruel sensuality that are so common on our earth, and are almost the sole source of our sins. They rejoiced in their newborn children as new sharers of their bliss. They never had any quarrels, and were never jealous of one another. They didn't even understand what jealousy meant. Their children were the children of all, for they were all one family. Illness was almost completely unknown among them, although death existed. But their old people died peacefully, as though falling asleep, surrounded by people taking leave of them, blessing those staying behind, smiling at them, and receiving their bright smiles in return. I never witnessed any sorrow or tears on these occasions, only love that reached the point of rapture, a sort of calm, contemplative rapture of fulfillment. One might have thought they maintained contact with their people after death, that the earthly link wasn't severed by it. They seemed puzzled when I asked them about eternal life, for apparently it was beyond all possible doubt to them. They didn't have any temples. Instead, they had a sort of tangible, live, and constant communion with the universal whole. They had no faith, but they had instead a firm knowledge that when their earthly happiness was filled to the limit, there would come for the living and the dead a day of even closer communion with the universal whole. They waited for that day with joy, but without impatience, without longing, as though they had a foreknowledge of it that they shared with one another in their hearts. In the evenings before retiring, they formed magnificent harmonious choirs, and in their songs they conveyed all the impressions of the departing day, praising it and bidding it farewell. They praised nature, earth, sea, and forest. They composed songs about one another, and in them showered childlike praise upon their friends. Their songs were very simple, but they came straight from the heart and penetrated other hearts. And it wasn't only in their songs. They really spent their whole lives admiring one another, as though they were all in love with one another. Some of their rapturous and solemn songs were completely beyond my understanding. Even when I understood the words, I couldn't grasp their entire meaning. It was beyond my brain power, but my heart seemed to soak it in. I often told them that I'd had a presentiment of all of this for years, that, while still on my original earth, I had experienced their joy and glory as a nostalgic feeling that at times reached a pitch of unendurable torment, that I'd sensed them in all their glory in the visions of my heart and mind, that back on our earth I'd often been unable to look at the setting sun without tears, that my hatred for the people of our earth had always contained a feeling of despair. Why couldn't I hate them without loving them? As they listened to me, I saw very well that they couldn't imagine what I was talking about. But I wasn't sorry that I told them those things, for I knew that they felt through my words how terribly I yearned for all those I had left behind me. Yes, as they gazed at me with their eyes so full of love, I felt I was becoming as pure and truthful as they were, and that it didn't matter whether I actually understood them or not. A feeling of the fullness of life seized me by the throat, and I adored them in silence. Now, of course, people laugh at me and assure me that I couldn't possibly have noted all these details in my dream, and I must have had some vague feverish sensation engendered by my own heart, and that I invented all the intricacies only after I woke up. And when I suggest to them that perhaps everything really did happen, you should hear them laugh. Yes, they laugh in my face. There's no doubt, of course, that I was completely overwhelmed by my dream, and that the sensation it left lingered on in my torn, aching heart. But then the actual images, that is, those I really did see during the hour while I was dreaming, were so harmonious, so overwhelmingly enchanting, and so true that when I awoke, I found words were too feeble to express them. And so they were bound to become blurred in my mind. Perhaps then I was forced, without being aware of it, to invent details later, distorting them, of course, in my anxiety to hurry to communicate them somehow. But how could I help believing that everything had actually happened? Perhaps it was even thousands of times better, happier, or more radiant than I could convey. Call it a dream, but it must have happened all the same. But as I said, maybe it wasn't a dream at all, for something happened there, something so frighteningly real that it couldn't have been a dream image. Let's assume that my heart generated the dream. How could my heart, after that, have generated the horrible things that happened? How could I have invented it or dreamed it up? How could my pretty heart and my puny mind arrive at such a revelation of truth? Judge for yourself, for I'm going to tell you about the truth, which up to now I have refused to reveal. The truth is that, that I ended up corrupting them all. Chapter 5. Yes, in the end, I corrupted the lot of them. How I managed to do it, I can't say. I don't remember too clearly. My dream flashed through eons, leaving in me only a general impression of the whole. All I know is that I caused their fall from grace, like a sinister trichina, like a plague germ contaminating whole kingdoms. I contaminated with my person that entire happy, sinless planet. They learned how to lie. They came to love it. They grew to appreciate the beauty of untruth. It may have started with a joke, innocently, playfully, with a flirtation, but the germ of the lie penetrated their hearts, and they took a fancy to it. Then came voluptuousness, and voluptuousness begot jealousy, and jealousy begot cruelty. I don't know how soon, but it wasn't long before the first blood was shed. Those people of the other earth were shocked and horrified, and they started to break up and disperse. Alliances were formed only to be directed against other alliances. Recriminations and accusations flew to and fro. They learned about shame, and they made a virtue of it. The concept of honor appeared, and each alliance hoisted its colors. They started to torture animals, and animals escaped into the forests and became their enemies. They fought to secede, for independence, for individual advantages, for what's mine and what's yours. They ended speaking different languages. They experienced suffering and came to love it. They declared that suffering was the only way to truth. Then science spread among them. As they became evil, they talked about fraternity and humanitarianism and came to understand those concepts. As they became criminal, they invented justice and drew up voluminous codes of laws to enforce their justice, and built a guillotine to enforce their laws. They only dimly recalled the things they had lost, and refused to believe that there had been a time when they were pure and happy. They even dismissed as ridiculous all possibility of return to that lost bliss, branding it a pipe dream. They were unable to visualize or conceive of it, and a strange thing happened. While they ceased completely to believe in their lost bliss, dismissing it as a fairy tale, they longed so much to become happy and innocent once more that they capitulated to their own wishes and, like small children, proceeded to worship their longings. They built countless temples, deified their own wishful thought, and prayed to it. And although they were certain their wishes could never come true, they worshipped them with tears in their eyes. Probably, however, if they had been given a chance to regain their lost state of innocence and bliss, if someone had pointed it out to them and asked them whether they wanted to return to it, they'd have refused. They told me, "We are false, cruel, and unjust. We know it. We deplore it, and we torture ourselves because of it. Punish ourselves perhaps even more cruelly than the merciful judge who will sit in judgment over us and whose name we do not know. But then we have science, and with its help we shall discover truth once more. Then we shall accept it in full knowledge. Knowledge is of a higher order than feeling. Awareness of life is of a higher order than life. Science will give us wisdom. Wisdom will reveal to us the laws of nature, and a knowledge of the laws of nature will confer upon us a happiness beyond happiness." Slavery made its appearance, even voluntary slavery, in which the weak submitted to the strong of their own free will, if only in order to gain their support, to oppress those who were even weaker than themselves. Saints came to those people and preached to them about their pride, their loss of a sense of proportion, their loss of shame. The saints were laughed at and stoned. The blood of the saints splattered the doors of the temples. Then came men who started to toy with ideas of how to reunite the people. They tried to devise a society in which each individual, while continuing to love himself above everyone else, would at the same time abstain from interfering with others. Thus, they imagined men could live together in a harmonious society. Whole wars were fought over that idea. Those who fought firmly believed that science and wisdom and the instinct of self-preservation would finally force men to unite in a harmonious, reasonable society. And, in the meantime, these wise ones were in a hurry to exterminate the unwise, who couldn't grasp their idea, and thus prevent them from hindering its triumph. The feeling of self-preservation began to give way. Soon there arrived the proud and voluptuous, who wanted all or nothing. To obtain all, they didn't hesitate to commit crime. If that didn't work, they were prepared for suicide. Religions appeared, worshipping the non-being, and self-annihilation for the sake of an eternal repose in nothingness. Finally, these people grew tired in their senseless efforts, and suffering appeared on their faces. Then they proclaimed that suffering is beautiful because suffering alone contains thought. So they praised suffering in their songs. I walked among them, wringing my hands in despair and crying over them. I believe I loved them even more than before the suffering had appeared on their features, when they were still so pure and beautiful. I loved their degraded earth more than I had loved it when it was a Garden of Eden, if only because sorrow had made its appearance in it. Alas, though I have always welcomed sorrow and torment for myself, I was not happy to see them struck by it, and it made me cry. I stretched out my hands towards them, cursing and loathing myself in my despair. I told them I was responsible for everything that had happened to them, I alone, that it was I who had introduced falsehood, contamination, and vice among them. I beseeched them to crucify me and explained how they should prepare the cross. I didn't have the strength to kill myself, but I longed to be martyred at their hands. I longed for martyrdom. I wanted them to shed my blood drop by drop to the last drop. But they merely laughed at me and ended by taking me for a feeble-minded fool. They exonerated me, explaining that they had asked for whatever they had, and that it had been bound to happen. Finally, they warned me that I was becoming dangerous and that they would have to lock me up in a madhouse if I didn't shut up. That hurt me terribly. Sorrow compressed my heart, and I felt I would die, and then, well, then I woke up. It was morning already. The sun hadn't risen, but it was after 5. I found myself in my old armchair. My candle had completely burned out. Next door in the captain's room, they were all asleep. Everything was very quiet, a very rare state in this house. I immediately jumped up. I was absolutely stunned, for nothing like that dream had ever happened to me. I'd never even fallen asleep in my armchair before. As I stood there regaining my senses, my eyes fell upon the loaded gun lying ready on my desk, but I immediately pushed it away from me. Now I had a great thirst to live. I raised my hand to call out to the eternal truth, but I didn't call out. I began to weep instead. I was overcome by boundless rapture. Yes, I wanted to live and to preach. At that very instant, I decided to preach, and of course I'll go on preaching as long as I live. I'll go from place to place preaching. I want to preach. I'll preach the truth, for I've seen it with my own eyes. I've seen it in all its glory. And so, since then, I've been preaching. Moreover, I love everybody. Those who laugh at me even more than the rest. Why? I don't know. I can't account for it. But so be it. They say that even now I don't make much sense, that in fact I make less and less sense. They wonder where I will end up. What they say is true. I'm becoming confused, and things may get even worse. There's no doubt about it. I'll often get muddled up before I find the right words to preach and the right deeds to perform, because it's terribly difficult. Why? I'm very much aware of that at this very moment. But then, who doesn't get confused? Still, we're striving for the same things. We're all, from the sage to the worst criminal, making our way toward the same objective. Only we're trying to get there by different roads. That's an old truth. But here's something that's new about it. I can never stray too far from my course. You see, I've seen the truth. I've seen it. And I know that men can be happy and beautiful without losing the ability to live on earth. I refuse to believe that wickedness is the normal state of men. And when they laugh at me, it is essentially at that belief of mine. But how can I not have faith since I've seen the truth? I didn't arrive at it with my intellect. I saw it in its entirety, and it is inconceivable that it could not exist. So how can I lose my path? Of course, I may wander off it a few more times and speak in alien words, perhaps, but it'll never be for long. The vivid picture of what I saw in my dream will always guide me and correct my course. I'm fresh and cheerful, and I can go on like this for another 1,000 years. You know, at first I wanted to conceal the fact that I'd corrupted them, but it was a mistake. It was the first mistake, and truth whispered in my ear that I was guilty of deception and saved me and showed me my way. But I don't know how to organize a paradise on earth because I cannot convey it in words. After my dream, I lost the words that could convey it, at least the most important, indispensable ones. But never mind, I'll go and speak tirelessly, for I've seen it with my own eyes, although I'm unable to tell what it is I've seen. But here's something that those who laugh at me cannot see. They say, "So, he had a dream, a hallucination." Well, is that really such a wise objection? Why are they so proud of it? A dream? What's a dream? And what's our life if it isn't a dream? And I may say, moreover, all right, suppose it never happens. Let's say paradise will never come about. I know myself it won't, yet I'll still go on preaching. And on the other hand, it would have been so simple. In one day, in a single hour, Everything could have been arranged. The key phrase is, love others as you love yourself. And that's all there is to it. Nothing else is required. That would settle everything. Yes, of course, it's nothing but an old truth that has been repeated and repeated millions of times and still hasn't taken root. Awareness of life is of a higher order than knowledge of the laws of happiness. That's an adage we must fight, and I shall fight it. And if everyone wanted it, everything could be arranged immediately.